It began as a dinner worth $800 million, but ended as something no one could have imagined. Two powerful men believed silence meant weakness, and they were about to pay the price. She watched from the shadows, unnoticed, unheard, but she saw everything, and when the silence broke, it shattered the room like glass. Secrets hidden in contracts, exposed by someone they thought invisible. A single recording, powerful enough to destroy empires. They tried to silence her, but the wrong woman had finally spoken. This is not just a story about business. It's a story about power, respect, and the voice that changed everything. The city lights of San Francisco burned like scattered diamonds against the night sky. But inside the rooftop restaurant, the atmosphere was darker than the view outside. The air smelled of roasted duck, truffle oil, and expensive bourbon. Yet, beneath the fragrance, there lingered something bitter. Ego, arrogance, and the kind of pride that turns a dinner into a battlefield. At the head of the long, polished walnut table sat Kamiko Hayashi, a woman whose very silence demanded attention. Silver hair pinned neatly in a bun, indigo silk dress flowing like still water, her expression calm and unreadable. She had built her empire from the ground up, carving her name into the global tech industry with brilliance and resilience, and yet tonight she did not speak. Not a word of English left her lips. She didn't need to. She chose silence. It was her shield, her test, her unbreakable armor. Across from her sat two men who were convinced they ruled the room. Derek Caldwell, CEO of Valencourt Biotech, broad-shouldered blonde hair slicked back to perfection, every movement dripping with confidence. His tailored gray suit cost more than most people's rent, and his bourbon glass never left his hand. Beside him sat Trent Langley, his younger, sharper CFO. He was the type who carried hunger in his eyes, the kind of man who looked at people the way predators look at prey. His flashy watch caught the glow of the candles every time he lifted his glass. Together, they were sharks who believed the ocean belonged to them, and tonight, they believed they were circling a woman too quiet to fight back. Trent smirked as he leaned closer to Derek, not bothering to lower his voice. "You think she even understands a damn word we're saying?" Derek chuckled, loud enough for the whole table to hear. "Doubt it. But hey, $1 billion buyout for a silent sushi doll? I'll take that deal any day." The words fell heavy into the candlelit air. They were meant to sting, to reduce the woman at the head of the table to something ornamental, decorative, powerless. But Kamiko didn't flinch. Her fingers stayed steady around the stem of her glass as she lifted it, took a slow sip of wine, and placed it back on the table without so much as a twitch in her expression. The insult dissolved against her composure, like a stone thrown into a still lake. Yet not everyone at that table was blind. Moving quietly between the shadows, refilling glasses and clearing plates, was Naomi Brooks. Young, graceful, and dressed in a neat red uniform with a white apron tied firmly around her waist. To most in the room, she was invisible. Just a waitress, a part of the background, a moving shadow trained to stay silent. But Naomi's almond eyes caught everything. The arrogance in Derek's grin, the cruelty hidden in Trent's laughter, the dismissive tone dripping from every word spoken. She wasn't just serving wine. She was witnessing a storm brewing at that table, a storm no one else seemed to feel. The first toast came from Derek, who raised his bourbon with the flourish of a man who believed the world belonged to him. "To global partnerships," he declared, his voice echoing in the private room. "To a future where science knows no borders." He smiled like an actor rehearsing for a magazine cover. Kamiko lifted her glass with a nod. Not a speech, not even a word in English. Instead, she leaned slightly toward her aide, murmured a few syllables in Japanese. The aide, face blank, as stone, translated in a flat voice. "Ms. Hayashi appreciates the sentiment." That was it. That was the pattern. Derek and Trent filled the air with long speeches about mergers, profits, market capture, timelines, and power. They laughed between their words, gesturing grandly as though they commanded an invisible audience. Kamiko answered with one or two phrases, always calm, always measured. Her aide translated into a single sentence. No more, no less. The silence gnawed at the two men like an itch they couldn't scratch. Trent tapped his pen impatiently against the table, his leg bouncing under his chair. Finally, he leaned toward Derek, muttering loud enough for half the table to hear. Are we seriously negotiating with a statue? This is insane. Derek forced a polite grin. It's cultural, he whispered back. She's playing her game. Just be patient. But patience wasn't something Trent knew how to wear. He snapped his fingers at Naomi without so much as glancing at her. Hey, sweetheart, more Syrah. Keep it flowing. Sweetheart. The word landed on Naomi's ears like a leash, a reminder that in his eyes she was no more than service. She poured. Steadily, her hands calm, but her jaw tightened. Later, when Kamiko responded once again with her calm, translated sentence, Trent rolled his eyes. You know what? He said loudly. We could just replace her with a chatbot. At least then we'd get some real interaction. Derek chuckled, raising his glass. Both men laughed, oblivious to the way their words cut. Naomi caught it, the faint shift in Kamiko's eyes. A flicker, quick and sharp, like a wound registered deep inside. The billionaire didn't move, didn't react, but Naomi could see it. She knew that wound because she had lived with it herself. There was a time when Naomi had not been invisible, a time when her world was filled with color, with sound, with respect. She had grown up in Kyoto, her mother a diplomat stationed in Japan for nearly a decade. She remembered temple bells echoing in the summer air, cobbled streets lined with lanterns, paper cranes folded by small hands in quiet classrooms where no one asked her why she was different. She had learned Japanese before sarcasm, before bitterness, before invisibility. In Japan, she was simply Naomi. But when her family returned to the States, everything changed. Fluency in Japanese impressed others, just not when it came from her. Her intelligence was questioned, her abilities overlooked, her presence ignored. She became invisible, trained to smile, trained to serve, trained to stay silent in rooms that never wanted her voice. Now, standing in that golden-lit restaurant, she looked at Kamiko and saw the same silence. It wasn't weakness. It was survival. It was armor. But tonight Naomi could feel it cracking. The conversation at the table grew colder. Derek drummed his fingers like a man waiting for applause. Kamiko answered questions with precise calm. Trent grew restless. Finally, he tossed his napkin onto the table and leaned forward, his voice drenched in mockery. Let's cut the act. We want to buy your company. Do you understand? Derek laughed, not because the moment was funny, but because he believed he owned the room. Maybe we should bring out some flashcards, he added. His grin stretched wide, dripping with condescension. Naomi's fingers tightened on the edge of the wine carafe. Her ears burned. The words weren't just insults to Kamiko. They were a slap across the face of every person ever spoken over, underestimated, erased. She wanted to scream, but her manager's warning replayed in her head. Don't get involved. You speak only when spoken to. Kamiko blinked once, slowly. She didn't retaliate. She didn't rise. She simply breathed, poised and unshaken. And then softly, she whispered something in Japanese, not for her aid, not for translation. It was as though she spoke to the air itself. Is there no one here who sees me? The words pierced Naomi like lightning through her chest. She froze. Her heart hammered. She had heard those words before, not from Kamiko, but in her own life, whispered silently in classrooms, in interviews, in the quiet corners of her own heart. The ache of being invisible, the sorrow of being dismissed. Her hands trembled. Her breath quickened. She felt every lesson drilled into her spine. Stay quiet. Stay invisible. Do not interfere. But tonight, those lessons felt unbearably small. Tonight, the silence was heavier than the room itself, and Naomi knew she couldn't carry it anymore. She stepped forward. The click of her heels against the polished floor echoed in the silence, louder than any insult that had been thrown. Derek looked up, his brow furrowing in annoyance. Trent's smirk faltered into a frown. Naomi's manager, watching from the side, stiffened in horror. But Naomi kept walking. Her chest burned, her heart pounded, but her steps didn't falter. She stopped beside Kamiko, bowed low, so low it silenced the very air. Not the shallow nod of customer service, not the trained dip of hospitality, but a deep bow, the kind reserved for elders, for teachers, for those whose presence carried weight beyond words. When she rose, her voice was steady, clear, unshakable. In flawless Japanese, she spoke. Hayashi-sama, forgive me. I know I am not supposed to speak, but silence in the face of disrespect is betrayal. If you will allow me, I can help. The room froze. Derek's bourbon glass hit the table with a dull thud. Trent's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Kamiko's aide blinked, stunned. The golden light flickered across faces suddenly drained of arrogance. And for the first time that night, Kamiko's eyes softened. Not in surprise, but in recognition. Recognition of a voice that had waited too long to be heard. Recognition of a soul that saw her when no one else did. Slowly, she reached forward and touched Naomi's arm with a gentleness that carried more weight than any contract. In Japanese, she whispered back, "Thank you for seeing me." And in that single moment, the balance of power in the room shifted. The room had turned to stone. Derek's grin had slipped into disbelief. Trent's smirk collapsed into silence. And for the first time all evening, the air felt heavy with something they couldn't control. Naomi's words still hung there, sharp as glass, slicing through the arrogance that had ruled the table only minutes ago. She stood beside Kamiko, apron tied neatly around her waist, but her presence carried the weight of someone far greater. The two men stared at her like she was a ghost that had walked straight through their carefully crafted illusion. Kamiko's eyes softened, a quiet storm hidden behind them, finally finding its echo. She leaned forward just slightly and whispered in Japanese, her words carrying the fragile weight of gratitude. "Thank you for seeing me." Naomi's heart thudded in her chest. In that instant, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Purpose, alignment, the sudden certainty that her voice mattered. For the first time, Kamiko wasn't alone at that table, and Naomi wasn't invisible anymore. The silence stretched on until Derek finally cleared his throat, trying to claw his way back. Into control. "Cute," he muttered, his voice dripping with disdain. "The help wants to play translator. That's not how billion-dollar deals work." Trent chuckled nervously, though his bravado was fading. "Yeah," he added. "Why don't we let the professionals handle the business, sweetheart?" The word hit Naomi like fire, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she turned toward the contract folder lying on the table, its leather cover gleaming under candlelight like a serpent waiting to be uncoiled. She picked it up, her fingers steady, and began flipping through the pages. Derek leaned back, his arrogance returning in fragments. "You're not a lawyer. You wouldn't even understand what you're reading." Naomi's eyes skimmed the words with precision, born of long nights spent helping her mother proofread diplomatic briefs. She paused at a clause, and her voice rang. "Clear. This section gives Valancourt unrestricted rights to renegotiate all intellectual property licenses after the merger. That means you could strip every patent Ms. Hayashi developed and sell them without her approval." Derek's jaw tightened. "That's standard." Naomi shook her head. "No, it's deliberately vague. It's a trap hidden in plain sight. She flipped to another page, her finger pressing firmly against the text. Here, Section 12. A non-compete clause so broad, it wouldn't just stop Ms. Hayashi from founding a new company. It bans her from teaching, from consulting, from speaking at conferences for 10 years. The words fell into the air like thunder, shaking the ground beneath Derek and Trent's arrogance. Their silence betrayed them before their mouths could. Naomi looked directly at them, her voice sharper than steel. You're not just trying to buy her company, you're trying to erase her. The tension in the room became unbearable. Trent's nervous laugh cracked as he leaned forward, trying to wave it off. It's just precaution, nothing personal. Naomi didn't even glance at him. She closed the contract with a snap that echoed louder than any insult they had thrown all night. Everything about it is personal. Kamiko sat back in her chair, her calm face carrying the faintest trace of satisfaction, as if every move had been calculated, waiting for this very moment. She gave a quiet command in Japanese to her aide. The man stood, reaching into his blazer, and pulled out a small silver recorder. He placed it on the table, pressed a button, and suddenly the room filled with voices that did not belong to Naomi or Kamiko. Derek's voice, sharp and unmistakable, spilled out into the air. Cut the incentives. Absorb her executives. She'll never know the difference. Trent's laugh followed, loud and arrogant. She's lost in her own little world. We feed her whatever we want. The translator does the heavy lifting. The laughter on the recording was crueler than any that had been heard at the table tonight. It echoed against the walls, a damning chorus. Naomi's eyes hardened as she translated, though the meaning was already painfully clear. They assumed she didn't understand. They mocked her. They planned to dismantle her company in front of her, banking on her silence. Derek's face turned pale, his earlier confidence evaporating like smoke. Trent shot to his feet, anger sparking in desperation. You can't record private meetings without consent. That's illegal. Naomi turned toward him, her voice steady as stone. So is fraud. The silence that followed was suffocating. For the first time, the men who thought they owned the table found themselves cornered, exposed, stripped of the control they held so tightly. Derek's eyes darted to Kamiko, really looking at her for the first time. She was no longer the quiet woman across the table. She was a fortress, and the storm had just broken. The recorder clicked off with a metallic beep, leaving behind a silence heavy with judgment. Naomi folded her hands in front of her, her voice low but devastating. You underestimated the wrong woman, and you forgot that silence doesn't mean surrender. The balance of power had shifted completely, but the night wasn't done testing Naomi. The door slammed open. Her manager, Foster, stormed into the room, his face red with rage. He barely glanced at the executives. His fury was aimed directly at Naomi. What the hell was that? He hissed. You left your station. You interrupted a private meeting. You spoke to a guest. His voice was venomous, low enough to cut deep. Naomi stood tall, not moving an inch. You're finished here? Foster spat. Pack your things. You're fired. Effective immediately. Trent leaned back with a cruel smile. Finally, someone in this place gets it right. Naomi's chest burned, but not with fear. She had already crossed the line where fear mattered. Her voice had carried the truth, and no matter the cost, she knew she had done the right thing. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, another voice cut across the room, calm, steady, commanding. Actually, she's not going anywhere. The words froze Foster mid-breath. Every head turned toward the door. A tall man in a navy suit stepped in, his presence filling the space instantly. Early 40s, clean-shaven, his expression carved from confidence. "My Jones," he said, introducing himself as he walked forward. "Executive Director of the North American Innovation Alliance, and a key financial partner behind Hoshiko's U.S. expansion." Derek's face drained of all color. Trent shifted uncomfortably, his smirk gone. Foster's mouth opened, but no words came. "I've been sitting in the main dining room for the past 20 minutes, Mai continued calmly. I heard enough of that recording. I saw how each of you behaved. And let me be perfectly clear, you're not firing Naomi Brooks tonight. In fact, she deserves an apology." The words hit harder than any slap. Naomi's throat tightened, her chest swelling with something she hadn't expected to feel. Validation. For the first time, someone had stepped in not to silence her, but to protect her voice. "You," Mai said, turning to Foster, his tone sharp. "We're about to punish the only person in this room who showed integrity. And you two," his eyes locked on Derek and Trent, "just showed the world what kind of leaders you really are." The silence that followed was a verdict. Naomi stood still, her apron still neatly tied, but her presence had transformed. She was no longer a waitress fading into the background. She was the woman who had changed the course of an $800 million deal with nothing but courage. Kamiko rose slowly from her chair, her indigo silk dress catching the golden light as she crossed the room. She stopped in front of Naomi, her silver hair gleaming, her presence commanding. She didn't offer a handshake. Instead, she reached out and gently took Naomi's hands in hers. Her voice, soft but steady, carried the weight of history. "You saw me when no one else did." Naomi's breath caught. Her voice trembled but didn't break. "I'd be honored. Truly." Kamiko smiled, a rare, quiet curve of her lips. "Then come with us. We have work to do, real work." The moment felt unreal, as though the door Naomi had been pushing against her entire life had not just opened but had been blown wide off its hinges. She wasn't walking out into the same world anymore. She was stepping into a future she hadn't dared imagine. The fallout came swift and merciless. Within 48 hours, whispers of the failed negotiation leaked into the tech world, traveling faster than any press release could. The recording spread through back channels, finding its way into the hands of oversight committees and board members. By the end of the week, Derek Caldwell had been forced to resign. His golden parachute shredded, his name scrubbed from Valancourt's website. Trent Langley followed days later, citing personal reasons. But everyone knew the truth. He had been exposed, humiliated, erased. The media devoured the story. Headlines called it poetic justice, from waitress to savior. The woman who stopped an $800 million power grab. Silence wasn't weakness. How a quiet CEO and a brave young woman changed everything. The internet hailed Naomi Brooks as the symbol of integrity in an industry starved for it. But for Naomi, it wasn't about headlines. It was about something deeper. She was no longer invisible. She was seen, valued, chosen. Kamiko Hayashi had not just won a battle. She had reminded the world that silence is not surrender. And Naomi Brooks had reminded them all that sometimes the most powerful voice comes from the one you never expected to hear. Real power doesn't always wear a suit. Sometimes it wears an apron. And sometimes the person you overlooked is the one who will rewrite the ending.